Last week's chapter was called The Sadducee King. This is the Pharisee Queen about Alexandra, the wife of King Alexander, who last we saw died trying to heal himself. He had malaria. He thought that exercise would help him feel better. He went off campaigning as he loved to do and overexerted himself, drank too much, and died out on the battlefield. Well, in camp, but we've been looking at the Hasmonean line. That's the line that's in charge during this time in history. They were descended from the family that liberated Israel, that led the revolt against the Seleucids. And we had that first generation, Judas, then Jonathan, then Simon, all ruled in their own special way. And then Simon's third son, John Hyrcanus, became king. And so it's his line that went on to rule. And we've had his sons, Aristobulus, and now Alexander has just died. And Alexandra, of course, is not of Hasmonean blood. She isn't. She entered the family by marriage, or Salome Alexandra. Salome was her Hebrew name. And she was the daughter, as I've already said, of a prominent Pharisee. Her brother was also a very prominent Pharisee, one of the greatest and wisest of Pharisee sages. He is remembered and quoted, and things about him are said a long time after this point. His name was Simon, and he helped with a lot of the reforms that she did. But John Hyrcanus arranged her marriage to Aristobulus before he had his big falling out with the Pharisees. And so after they were already married, Hyrcanus started favoring the Sadducees instead, felt like the Pharisees weren't really on his side. But after Aristobulus became king, Alexandra, you may remember, was involved in a plot to kill his younger brother Antigonus. She was one of those who orchestrated that situation in which Antigonus was killed on Aristobulus's orders by mistake because of miscommunication. And why she was involved in that, what they were trying to achieve, we don't know. We don't have a lot of details about Antigonus himself and why people wanted him dead. But after they were both dead, Antigonus and Aristobulus, Alexandra married Alexander, the third son, because Aristobulus had died childless. And as we learned last week, Alexander was a very unpopular ruler, a very brutal ruler who fought a long civil war using Greek mercenaries. That was a big thing. He used Greek mercenaries against his own people. And at the end of that war, he crucified 800 Pharisees. And when Alexander died, he told Alexandra to hand his body over to the Pharisees and give them political authority in order to win their loyalty. He recognized that if she didn't have the Pharisees on her side, the people would not be on her side, and she and her sons would not survive. So that's what Alexandra did, and the people accepted Alexandra as their queen. They didn't hold her responsible for the actions of her husband. And she was about 65 years old when she became queen. So she didn't rule that long just because of how old she was. She'd been through a lot before that point. So she was 65 years old, and she reigned for 9 years. So until she was about 74. And she and the Pharisees set to work right away, undoing the damage Alexander had done. And her brief reign, that 9 years, was seen by many of the Jewish people to be a golden age, the golden age of the Hasmonean dynasty. There were several educational and legal reforms. They started new schools, set new standards for education, and Alexandra's brother, Simon ben Shattak, he had a big hand in this. He was one of the main people who came up with these reforms and put them into practice. Simon had a passion for the law and proper legal proceedings. And according to tradition, Simon refused to condemn a man found standing next to a dead body with a bloody sword in his hand because there hadn't been a witness to the murder, and the man himself denied doing it. Just based on proper procedure, he said, we can't condemn this man. We didn't see it happen. And he said that they should trust God to do justice in that case. And in the story, whether or not it's true, the murderer, because he had killed the man, died soon after that from a snake bite. Okay, so. But another time, and this we are much more sure about that it actually happened, 2 witnesses, possibly Sadducees, possibly also people connected with a group of witches that he condemned and executed. But 2 witnesses, people who had a reason to hate Simon, accused Simon's son of a crime deserving death, a capital crime. And Simon's son was sentenced based on their evidence. And after that point, as Simon's son was on his way to be executed, the 2 witnesses confessed and said they had been lying all along. They withdrew their testimony. And so Simon tried to have the case reopened, but his son refused to go along with it. He said the proper legal proceeding must be followed. And according to that standard, evidence once given and accepted in court cannot be revoked. It cannot be taken back. And think of the practical reasons for that. If somebody comes as a witness into court and gives testimony, they should be confident that somebody isn't going to find them later and try to convince them to change their testimony, try to bribe them, try to threaten them. Once testimony is accepted, it has to stay in place. It can't be revoked. So after that point, because Simon's son died, he was executed. But Simon created new and stricter standards for cross-examining witnesses, for confirming their accounts, for making sure that justice was done, that testimony was not accepted without being thoroughly examined first. So what you see here in the picture is the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling body of Jewish religious leaders. They were kind of a political authority. They, at least when they had power, as they did under Alexandra, they had authority to put people to death. But they were also more of a religious court. Their standard was the law of God. If you broke the law of God, that's what they were there to determine. And they met in a side room of the temple, this little side room right here. It was called the Chamber of Hewn Stones. It was a special room built into the side of the temple so that the high priest could get to the meetings of the Sanhedrin without traveling too far away from the temple itself, because that's where he worked. And the high priest was a member of the Sanhedrin. And one of the most significant things that Alexandra and Simon did was to restore power to the Sanhedrin. It had existed before that time. It was there in the time of Alexander, but he kept it pretty well under his thumb. He made sure that most of the members were Sadducees, and that they relied on him for their positions. He was really the one in charge. But Alexandra gave real power back to the Sanhedrin. And Sanhedrin just comes from the Greek word for council. They were the council of the Jews. And there were smaller councils, smaller Sanhedrins that operated in many Israelite cities. But there was only one great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. And it was kind of like their supreme court for both political and religious disputes. And we're going to see the Sanhedrin become very important at key moments in the coming weeks. They were also important at key moments in the New Testament. And we're going to look at those places in a little bit. But the Sanhedrin had 71 members, including the high priest, so an odd number, so that there was never an even vote, a tie. The high priest was the one who cast the deciding vote if there was a tie. So they met every day in the chamber of hewn stones, except for Sabbaths and festival days. And at the height of their power, the Sanhedrin could legally appoint kings and high priests, declare war, determine proper procedures at festivals, and pronounce judgments against rulers, tribes, priests, and people who claimed to be prophets. They had the right to determine whether someone was telling the truth or not based on their knowledge of the law. And people had to go along with their decision. So, yeah, Matthew 26. The most famous time we see the Sanhedrin, Matthew 26, 57 through 59. Would someone like to read that?
Those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away by priests, scribes, and publicans. Peter followed him, listening to the high priest's court. And he went in and sat with the servants, Stephen. Chief priests, elders, and all the council thought all set on him to be clean.
So that word council, Sanhedrin is the Greek word for council. So that's the ruling council of the Jews, the Sanhedrin there. They're not meeting, in that case, in the chamber of hewn stones. They're meeting in the high priest's house. But it's still that same group of people. Although we find out later that not every member of the Sanhedrin was in agreement with putting Jesus to death. And nor were they all at that council meeting, as they would have been if it had been more official. But we also see this group come up in Acts chapter 5, verse 27 and 28. Acts 5, 27 and 28. And whoever gets there first can read it.
The apostles were brought in and made to appear before the Sanhedrin to be questioned. He gave you strict orders not to teach in this name. He said, you will have the You have fulfilled the teaching and are determined to make us guilty of this man's blood.
Yeah. And the fact that the apostles defied the orders of the Sanhedrin was an incredibly big deal for them. The Sanhedrin's power was limited under the Roman Empire. They didn't have the authority to sentence someone to death. But for a Jew, they were the authority. For somebody like Peter or John to say, I'm sorry, we're not going to accept the decision you've made, was unheard of. And I'm going to go ahead and read this one, Acts 22, last verse of 22, through chapter 23, verse 7. And this is talking about Paul on trial here. But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he, the Roman governor, released him and ordered the chief priests and all the Sanhedrin to come together, and brought Paul down and set him before them. Now Paul, looking intently at the Sanhedrin, said, Brothers, I have lived my life in all good conscience before God up to this day. And the high priest, Ananias, who was there because he was part of the Sanhedrin, commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? So the law of Moses, that was their standard. And we see a lot of little details confirmed about the Sanhedrin in this passage and how they operated. And this is something that was against protocol, something obviously that should not have been done. But those standing nearby said, Do you revile the high priest of God? And Paul said, I was not aware, brothers, that he was the high priest. For it is written, You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. But knowing that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the Sanhedrin, Brothers, I am a Pharisee, a son of the Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. And as he said this, there was dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. So, Ananias, the chief priest at this time, would have been a Sadducee. So Paul got the Pharisees in the assembly on his side. And yeah, like I said, the council was mostly Sadducees during the time of Alexander, mostly Pharisees under the time of Alexandra. By Paul's time, they were fairly mixed. But Josephus, the historian that we get a lot of this information from, usually has a very positive opinion of the Pharisees. He says that their interpretation of the law is considered best. The people love them. Some people, there's a good chance that Josephus himself was a Pharisee of some sort or very closely tied to them. But there was a darker side to Alexandra's reign and to what the Pharisees did during this time. And he records that in the Jewish War. He puts them in a little less of a favorable light. Josephus says, Now the Pharisees joined themselves to her, to Alexandra, to assist her in the government. Alexandra listened to all of their counsel, being herself a woman of great piety toward God. But these Pharisees artfully insinuated themselves into her favor little by little, and eventually became the real administrators of public affairs. They banished and demoted whomever they pleased, and they imprisoned and freed men at their pleasure. They also had people put to death. He doesn't say that here. But in short, they had the enjoyment of the royal authority, while the expenses and the difficulties of that came with that authority belonged to Alexandra. She was a very capable woman in the management of great affairs, and she was always looking for opportunities to bring more soldiers to her service. She increased the Jewish army by half its former size and procured a great number of foreign troops as well, until her nation became not only very powerful at home, but also terrible to foreign rulers. And so she governed many people, and the Pharisees, Josephus says, governed her. So the Pharisees were the ones pulling the strings. They were the ones really in charge from Josephus's perspective during this time. And the Pharisees had other concerns besides just the common good. And a lot of them used their newfound power to hunt down and to destroy anyone who might have had a hand in Alexander's persecution of them. Anybody who might have been involved in the decision to crucify those 800 Pharisees was obviously a target. But even beyond that, the line was very often crossed from justice into vengeance. And it got to be a very dangerous time to be a Sadducee. And it's a law of human nature. And when a group that has been oppressed, that has been persecuted, suddenly comes to power, like in the French Revolution, that hatred leads to cruelty. Cruelty leads to hatred. Hatred leads to cruelty. It's a cycle. And they persecuted the ones who had persecuted them. And this treatment of the Sadducees and the rift between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, specifically this persecution here, was one of the key factors that brought an end to Alexandra's golden age after her death. And the bitterness that infected the nation would not only lead to another war, but to the loss of Israel's independence and the end of the Hasmonean line. And that's as far as we're going today. Next week, we'll look at Alexandra's sons. And the first interaction we've seen in some time between the nation of Israel and the city of Rome. Let's go ahead and close. Father, thank you for the way that you're always at work, for the way that you've preserved your people in the past, protected them in the past, for the lessons that we can learn from them. And thank you that though even the best human authority can fail, that even the wisest leaders can make terrible mistakes, that even the best institutions can become corrupt and actually work against what you want to do, that you're always in control, that you're always sovereign, and that your word, your perfect standard, never changes. Help us to gain wisdom from your word, to be made wise by it, so that we can face what we need to face in life in a way that honors you. Help us to pay close attention to our own hearts and to your word and to what you want to teach us this morning, and to respond to it. In Jesus' name, amen.